What's up everyone, it's Javi here and this is part 6 of my Figma series on designing a Google search. In this video we're going to deep dive into components and auto layout and variants to create all of the remaining components that we need before we get into prototyping. If you are new to my channel or to Figma in general, then I would strongly recommend you to have a look at my previous videos where we go over everything you need to know before getting to this point. Otherwise, especially if you're new to Figma, you may be a little bit lost. So let's jump right to it. So as you can see, I divided the components here into 2 phases based on how we are going to be designing this. So let's go ahead and start here. This is what I called a search suggestion component, and this is if we go over to our Google, let's just come back here and start typing. That's this piece of the puzzle right here. This is going to be a component that we are then going to be nesting into our search component later. So before we get there, we actually need to have the component ready. And as you can see, I documented here a little bit how this component is structured. But for this tutorial, I'm just gonna duplicate it by holding my Alt key and then dragging down here until it becomes visible. I'm gonna bring back my Figma controls by holding my Command key and then pressing the period key, and that will bring back all of these. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna detach this doing Command Alt B. So that is how you can detach an instance of a main component from the component itself. So now we just have a layer, and I'm just going to be removing these, even though this will be quite easy to recreate. But as you can see, I created here a 584 by 40 pixel frame here. It's got our fill. We can actually change this to our background color token. And then the first thing I'm going to do is press F and do a 24 by 24 image here, and I'm going to place it centered horizontally and 16 from the left, and I'm going to be calling this our image layer. And then here we can just go to any of our existing layers with an image from Elon. We had a previous component, if you'll recall, in one of our previous videos where we had a bunch of images, so you can just grab any of those and then come here. We can use our centering tools here. And I'm just going to, can I do that? No. So if you have an image already framed, then I guess we can just remove this one. And if you have a larger one, let's say sort of like this, then the image should be already defined in such a way that if you are resizing it, the image is going to be sorted out accordingly. That's one of the benefits of using images as your fill for frames. We figured that out. This has a corner radius of 2, and then we're just going to start defining our text here. So this is using one of our text tokens already. So we have label, medium, regular. So I'm just going to type here Elon Musk and make sure that when you're defining this, you set it to this, and I can come over here and select our primary color token to make sure we're using our styling appropriately, and this I believe is 8 pixels different with respect to the image. And then I can duplicate this holding my Alt key. I think this has no spacing. I'm going to make this tertiary to properly organize the information, hierarchy, and then I'm going to change this to CEO of SpaceX. Now this is not going to be as large in text size as the title, so I can just come here, and I believe we may not have this particular text size already defined. We can define that later on. For the time being, I'm just going to manually set it up, and then we can always clean things up in the end after we have everything ready. So that looks pretty good. I think we don't have to do any more adjustments here, since this is going to be on its own, just sort of flexible to our needs. And then the way I would go about creating the component is Command Alt K. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And now it's a search suggestion component, and you can tell it's a component because of the little symbol right here and the coloring. And now if we want to create a variant of this, because as you can see, we not always have search results that have a profile image associated to it. We might just have a search that is an autocomplete function. Then what we can do is create a variant. So I'm going to come here, add a new variant, and then we can call this property type before we do anything to the layer itself. And I can call this person, and then this can be, let's say, autocomplete. And now what we would have to add is a search icon, which we have already from our previous designs. But before we do that, we also have to keep into account that this height is a little bit shorter. So I'm just going to go ahead and change that. And then regarding the placement of this, one thing to note is that the search icon has to be aligned with respect to the profile image that we just had above, right? So if you are holding your Alt key, you can more or less get a little bit of a guide here for how to set this up. And if you do it right, you will notice that there's a 20 pixel difference on the left. We can leave it here as we go. And then this one is going to be also the same kind of size as this. And as you may already expect, we want to have the same distance from the left. So this is 48, so let's make that 48 as well. I'm going to center align it as well as we can. And that should be it. So I'm going to change this to base text. And actually one way that we can introduce this autocomplete text right here is by using auto layout, and you're going to see why. So I'm just going to duplicate this and call this autocomplete. We're going to detach this because I don't think we have a medium style defined yet, and I'm going to auto layout them having both layers selected, and I'm going to call this just text. And what's really handy about using auto layout here is that if you imagine yourself filling these up in a real life example, you can see how, as you are adjusting one text, so this correct example could be Elon Musk, and then you can have here something like net worth, right? And as you can see, as I was typing the first text layer, the second one is adjusting, right? So I could type here anything. You can see that the second text layer will automatically adjust, and that is very handy for our purpose here. So I'm just going to actually roll things back to where things were to keep this generic. And then that should be pretty good to go. So now that we defined search suggestion, I can actually just delete it since we're going to keep this one as a reference. And we can move on to the next component here, which is an icon. And actually I did not use the icon component here because this icon is always going to be a search icon for the autocomplete. So it's not as relevant as a use case as having to need a component there. But why we're setting up this icon is because we then have a tab component which is going to require a variety of different icons based on the tab that you're in, right? So you'll see that if we can define this icon component, it's going to make our life much easier as we're defining that tab in the prototype example. So the way you can go about it is, I'm just going to duplicate this again, and actually I don't need to duplicate, I'm just going to start off by, let's say, grabbing this icon right here that we already have, and I'm just going to place it right here. And as before, we can do Command-Alt-K to make a component. I'm going to change this to icon, and because we want to have multiple icons, I'm going to come here to my variants, and I'm going to start setting up my variants. So I'm going to change this property to name. And one thing that's pretty handy when it comes to icons is, especially if you're leveraging something like a library like this, like Remix Icon, I always like to be able to copy paste the name of the icon from the library itself and paste it here as the name. It's just going to make the life of your engineers that much easier because they will be able to see the name of the icon as they are inspecting things when they're looking at your design, and then they can always cross-reference that with the library that they're using and find the icon instantly. They don't have to figure out which exact icon it is that you use. It's not always so obvious. So I'm going to keep that there, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring one of them over so you can see the flow, and then we can move on to the next component. But let's say we wanted to bring over this image right here, right? So I'm going to come here, I'm going to search for image, and I love Remix Icon because it's really large in terms of all the icons you have here, but especially I can just easily one-click copy the SVG, and then I can just come over here to my icon and paste it. And I can resize this to 16. I'm going to make sure it's center aligned. And now what I can do is, before I deframe this, I don't know if that's a word, deframing, but it sounds cool. I'm going to remove the previous vectors associated to the other icon, and I'm going to do Command-Shift-G to get rid of that parent frame that we don't need anymore. And I can just come here to my fill and change this to icon to keep it consistent. Oops, not this. We don't need this layer anymore, so I can just focus on this vector right here. And there we go. That's the right adjustment you want to be making. I can come back here to Remix Icon, grab the name, and where it says Variant 2, I'm going to change it to Image Line. One extra thing that I can show you here is that as this gets larger, it's common that you're going to run into a situation like this where you have an icon selected and you may want to change that icon to a different one, and you come here and you have all these things, right? So one of the things that I'm doing is at least sorting alphabetically, so I don't have to spend so much time having to figure out where that icon is. And the way you can sort these out is by going to your parent component here, to the main component, and just move these along, right? So if I would, for example, move search to the front of the line here, you can see that if I'm selecting this, search will be at the top, right? So just a tiny tip, if you're going to end up making variants of your icon, make sure that you spend a little bit of time organizing this. It's going to make your life a lot easier down the line. So now that we looked at that, I can actually remove this and that because we have our icons ready to go. The third component that we're going to look at is what I call the media component, and it's got 3 variants. And this one we are using, if I come back here to the example and I search for Elon Musk, you can see that there are some sections here in our search where we have top stories and videos. And if you pay careful attention, you will notice that this is actually a very similar component within itself, right? So it's got a title, it's got some kind of source, and it's got a media component, right? And in the case of the video section here, you can see that these are YouTube videos, which include a count of the duration of the video and a little bit more detail as well, like this preview text right here. So what we're going to do is actually create one single component for all 3 of these variants, for our image, for video, and for YouTube video. So we can start off just by grabbing this one, and we already had, in a previous video, I already had a component set up, but we didn't talk about it. But essentially what you can do to get up to speed here, this is another way, by the way, to do the image inside a layer. So if you'll compare this one, we have the image being the fill of the layer, and in this case here we have a frame called media, and inside there's an image. The reason I did it for this video is because I was coming into this image here, and you will see that I'm right-clicking to go into my plugins, and one of the plugins that I have here is Unsplash. And so you'll see here that now Unsplash is going to open up, and I can click on search here, and I can search for things like Tesla, and that is how I was getting the images for these right here, right? So the plugin wouldn't be able to do that unless there was an explicit layer for an image which is the case for this, but it's not the case for when you have an image fill in a frame. So you cannot run the unsplash component there. Given that we have a layer here for our media frame and an image inside of it, what I can do is Command-Alt-K to create component, and you're already getting used to this, I know, to create variants for this, and we're gonna first of all change this, let's say, to type. I'm not sure that's the one, the name. Yes, I use the name here as well, type. And just to show you an example of, let's say, this one that's a little bit more complex of the YouTube video, we can just have this be type image. This can be type YouTube video, because the video one is essentially a simpler version of the YouTube video component. So once you know how to make this one, you'll be solid for the one above. So one thing I can do here is come back here to my remix and grab a play icon of sorts. So I think this is the one I used, play circle fill, and I'm going to come here to my YouTube video. I'm just going to paste it, and I'm going to increase the size proportionally by holding my Alt and Shift key as I am moving the right corner of this layer, just to make it 32 by 32. I'm going to make this FFF for white, and then I'm going to slightly decrease the opacity to 80 so it blends a little bit with the image as we want it. Now the other things that we have to do here is add a video duration and a preview. So before we get to that, one thing we can do is add a little bit of a gradient in the background so that there's a little bit of contrast between these top layer elements like the duration and the play and the preview. So I'm just going to add a fill here, and I'm going to keep this at linear. I'm just going to make sure that these are opposite actually. So I'm going to come down here and change the opacity to 0. I'm going to set this actually to all the way down here for black. And I'm going to come here, I'm going to set opacity to the max. Actually, this might not be max, this might be something like 50, and this might be something like 10. So there's a bit more of subtleness to how the gradient is being applied across the image. And the remaining things we have to do is add a counter, which in this case we're using a text style that we already have defined. So we can just come here and use that style here, which is a 12 pixel size text. And now I'm going to select the text and change the fill here to our background color, so there's a strong contrast in between. And what I did here is, I believe I used auto layout to actually set up some nice paddings here. So 8, 8, 1, and 1. So you can do that by coming in here, Shift A, and then coming to your paddings and then just adjusting those and setting the text in the middle. So this is 8, 8, 1, and 1. And then I can just come here to the fill, make it dark, and set a very tiny opacity to it, increase the corner radius to something like 24, and then just place it right here. So let's say 4, 4. And I think this may actually be a little bit of a darker fill. Yeah, so it's more like 50%. Okay, so we got that, and then the preview text is just a simple preview text layer. So I'm going to come here, actually I'm going to make this uppercase by default, and I'm going to change this to white using the background color token that we have already, and I'm going to set this up probably down here. I'm not sure there's any specification for it, no. And then I'm going to adjust the constraints so it stays nicely responsive if we need it to be. And I can come here and change the weight of the text so it's much more noticeable, and maybe even add a little bit of a shadow if we want, right? So I think this is, yeah. So what we can do is we can come here into effects and select here the little sun icon here for effect settings, and I'm just going to change the blur to 1. I'm going to change the Y value to 1. So it's a very subtle, very small shadow. And I'm going to leave this at, we can put it at 40%. So it's a little bit more noticeable. And now you can see that the text has a little bit of a pop on top of the image, which helps with the contrast of the layer itself. Now we can change this to counter, just if we want to be a little bit more organized with our naming there. And now you can see we basically have two variants, and the third one is actually quite easy. All you have to do is just remove things from the YouTube video one and just create a new variant and you're good to go. I'm going to remove this from you because we already have it here already. And now let's go over these. We have this TweetCard, which is just a simple frame that's 212 by 236. So let's do that. 212 by 236. The fill should be set to background, and we have a light stroke. So I'm going to come here, set up a divider, and then we want to give this a little bit of a corner radius so it has a little bit of a card feeling to it. And now we can call this card for now. And what you can note here is that there's two variants. One of them has an image and one doesn't. And you can use variants here in a nice way because I'm just going to copy paste this here to simple text layer. You can see here it's just a description. It's got a left and right adjustment for the constraints. So that, for example, if I were to resize this Twitter card, the text would adjust accordingly. But we're just going to leave it at that. And also there is a little reference here for Twitter and when this was posted. And what you should know about this layer is that actually here we can probably use our text token, and you can see that it has a primary color token for the Twitter part and a tertiary color token for the day since it was published, right? So just doing information depth on the spot with colors. And you can see here that it's also got some constraints like left and right and bottom. So if you were to resize this up and down, you get the expected effect. And what we can do to set up this variant is, first of all, make this a component. We can call this, was it TweetCard? Yes, TweetCard component. Then create a variant for it that's, let's match the styling that we have up here in terms of how we organize these layers. And now you can come here and you can come to the variant properties and you can change this to true. And if you have a true and false configuration for any particular property, you can see what happens here. So I'm going to come here to the property name and call it with image. And it's going to have two properties for this to work. It can either be false or true. So for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to decrease, actually copy paste this text to make the situation a little bit easier. I'm going to bring this down. And I'm going to copy paste this image, which in our case here is just a frame with an image as the fill. And I'm going to set a little bit of a 12 pixel distance here following our implicit 8 pixel grid as best as we can. And now if you have this set up with your true and false and you find yourself creating a couple of these tweet cards, then have a look. You will have an instance of this component, and on the right you have a toggle that allows you to easily just toggle the image on or off. And that is pretty cool. Now let's take it up an extra notch and have a look at the search result component. Now this one is quite simple inherently since it's just text. So the most important parts about this component is how you are going to be leveraging text size and color to set up the proper information hierarchy and depth for the information. So you can see that in this case the most important piece of information is the title and it's a link. So you want to make sure that you're using a larger text size with the link color token set up. You have here on the top the source of where this is coming from, and Here you have the site using the primary color token, you have the slug, which is using a tertiary color token, and then you just have a simple icon for the dropdown if you want to go into that. And then here you have a description, and you also have I call it footer reference. The most interesting bit about this component is the way that we applied auto layout and variants to make it a bit more dynamic. We don't have to recreate this entirely because you have everything that you need at this point in order to know how to make this on your own. But what I want to show you is essentially that I have two toggles here for footer reference and description, and in the same way that I just showed you how you could do that for the TweetCard, you can do that for this frame right here, for this component. So if you look at the variants, you can see that I have two variants, footer ref and description, and both have true and false values. So what that means is that you can come here and essentially remove the description if you want, right? So it's that simple. If you want a search result without a description, which can happen, you can remove the description. And if you want it without the footer reference, you can also remove that as well. Now, the extra piece of magic is, if you're noticing this, as I'm removing the description, everything else is adjusting in position. How is that happening? Well, this is happening through auto layout. And if you dive deep into the layer a little bit, you can see that if you click here, there's an auto layout setup with a 4-pixel separation between the layers. You can see that source is a frame, title is a text layer that is filling up the container. It's the same situation for the description, and in the case of the footer reference, it's the case as well, right? So if you were to even resize this, which won't be the case for us, but if you were to have to do that, let's say for example to do a mobile version or any sort of screen that has a smaller width, then you can easily just adjust things. That's all you need to know basically about this search result component. And I encourage you to give it a shot from scratch if you want to. All you have to do is just go layer by layer with that text styling, and then set up the auto layout for all of the frames put together up and down. And then you can essentially then set up the variants to show and hide the different properties of the component. We already had defined the search component itself. We had an active state, we had a hover state for both our home variant, as we call it, and our search result variant. If you haven't watched that video, I'm going to drop the link in the description below where we're creating this search component from scratch. And in this video, what we're going to do is work on this focus state right here, which has these results, right? So to do that, what I did is I grabbed the hover that we already had, and this is the same sort of process that you will do for the search result variant here as well. So just stay with me here for the hover, and then you'll be in good shape to do the other one. So we've got our search here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to detach it from the main component so I have a little bit more of control over what's going on. And I'm going to hold my command key as I'm dragging this down just to have some extra space. And for the record, if I wasn't holding my command key, you can see that things just resize based on the proportions that we have in there based on the constraints. So if you don't want that to happen as you're resizing frames, the way to do it is by holding your command key. So hold command key resize, it's just going to resize that particular frame without resizing any of the inner components or elements. And now what we have to add here is essentially a divider, which I already have here set up for you. So if you wanted to recreate this from scratch, all you have to do is press your R key and then just drag this along, set up the right width and height, and then just change this to the divider color style. And I believe this is a 0 pixel distance with respect to the search component here. So actually here we don't have that layer anymore. So I'm going to have to recreate it by grabbing these again. And let's just say we're going to call this search. And we can keep this with the right constraints on the top. And now I'm going to bring this up here, 33, and then we're just going to make sure that we match the original dimensions for this. So this was 46 pixels. So let's just go ahead and do that. Awesome. And I'm going to drag it also to the sides as well. So it's going to be just sitting at the very top there. And then everything should be properly set up. So this is going to be 16 by 16. We can left and right this, and that should be all we have to do for our divider. And now this is going to go actually quite fast because we already have this component set up. So for the search result. So what I would do is I would come up here. I can copy the autocomplete variant, or just any variant of this component, and I can drag it right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this a couple times. So I'm going to create at least 2, and this will actually be the person version. I'm going to align these to the exact pixel distance here. And now that we have 2, we can auto layout them into a list. So I'm going to call this suggestions, and change the resizing here to fill container, so that this container itself can stretch to the parent container of our search component. And I'm just going to give this, for now, let's say a 4 pixel distance from the divider. What I can do actually is come here to our padding and then just put 4 up and down, so we don't have to do that manually. It's just sort of part of the layer. And now we can just nicely match it with our divider right there. The whole resizing bit was just so that in case I were to do something like that, you can see that the inner layers are resizing, and that is why we did all those tiny adjustments for the constraints. Now that we have the suggestions list, I can just copy paste this multiple times. So something like that. Google will show you up to 10 search results as suggestions here, and in this case we have 1 that's the person himself. So we're going to have that, and then 9 autocomplete suggestions. Just going to make sure we have some space here, and we're going to resize this actually in the end so it's a bit more dynamic. The last bit that we have to do is bring in the buttons, right? So what I did is I created a layer as a frame that has a fixed height of 68 pixels, which is going to be the container for where our buttons will live, and then I just copy pasted the buttons from one of the screens that we had in a previous design, right? So we don't have to do anything new there, just make sure that our buttons sit nicely centered within this divider. This is a 16 by 16 on top and bottom padding. What we can do now is just left and right align this as well. And to wrap things up, what we can do is actually make this whole thing an auto layout. And what this is going to give us is a little bit more of a dynamic touch as we may go about removing some of these, right? So if I were to have less suggestions, you can see that the container entirely is resizing. And so you would just have to make sure to do this within the search component variant section. So then you could come in here and just make sure that it's properly connected to the variants that we defined before. The beauty of it is that if we ever have to, let's say, change the inner component here, let's say that we want to come up here and let's say Google decides one day that this should not be medium, it should be black, because it's not obvious enough and we have to put it in people's faces, this autocomplete suggestion. Then you can see that as I do that, it's going to automatically update all of the instances of this other component. So you're going to essentially come across this logic a lot of times, especially as you build more and more complex components that are using smaller components within them. It just makes the maintenance of the overall design system a little bit easier, because you don't have to go around and change a lot of things if you just have one component that's within a bunch of other components and it's being reused, and then you just have one instance that you have to change for changes to be applied all over, right? So that is the beauty of atomic design and design systems. So now that we have that, let's look at our last components here, and let's go here into the tab component and have a look at this one. This one's also pretty interesting. because we start off with a text and an icon, right? So for this particular area here, you can see that I started off with a text here that's a 13 pixel size. So let's just start right there. We can call it all. And I also grabbed the icons, which we talked about earlier as needed for this tab to really show us some magic. So I'm going to put it here. I'm going to set up a 4 pixel distance between them, and I'm going to auto layout it. And we can center this to make sure that the alignment is right internally. And without changing much of the styles in itself, because you are already highly familiarized with that, one thing to keep in mind for this component is that as it resizes, there's always going to have to be a 16 pixel padding on both sides of the upper area of the tab, right? Where you have the icon and the text, there is 16 pixel padding on left and right. So you can achieve that result through auto layout by coming in here and setting up 16 pixel on the sides. So even if you were to put something like maps here or something very long, you can see that this is going to be preserved, right? So that's part one. And then the other thing we want to do is have a sort of active indicator. So this is just a rectangle, right? So I just created a rectangle and put it below. And this is going to be sort of, let's say, 12 pixel distance from here. And we're using an auto layout here as well to achieve that sort of dynamic rendering of the tab as it's being increased in width as the text changes, right? So I can come here and auto layout it. And the thing to keep in mind here is that we're going to come to our padding and have our elements centered. And the last thing we have to do is, instead of having a fixed width for that active indicator rectangle, we're going to actually fill container. And that is how you can achieve a nice tab component in general, right? So if I were to write anything here like the Mandalorian, say, to have a very long random piece of text, then you can see that the rectangle is resizing accordingly as well, thanks to that auto layout function that is keeping everything on the same width. And then once you have that, you can essentially create a variant of it with different color tokens to indicate whether one tab is active or not. And instead of actually using active and inactive, you can actually change this to active and then have a true or false, right? So just like we were doing before, if I were to grab this and have an instance, you can set this up to active, true or false quite easily. And the last bit that's really helpful for this tab component here is that because we use our icon as the component with the variants, we can always come into this icon and change it. So if we have another tab that's going to be, for example, about maps, right, or images, we can change it to image, and we can just change this to images, right? So if you're imagining yourself creating that set of tabs, which we will do in the next video, it's going to be really, really, really fast because we have everything set up to just one-click things into place. Now we have two components left. This is the MediaResult component. What's relevant about this component is that we have variants for whether the placement is on the right or on the left. And the reason for this is actually, if you come back to our analogy of how these two things are very similar to each other, and the main difference is whether the media is placed to the right or the left, then that is going to be the variant that we're going to keep in place here. And essentially the way I did it is I organized, first of all, an info layer that is a 490 by 96 frame, and inside I put all the information, right? So just using the color tokens and text styles that we already have to create a title, the source, and the date of publication. And you can have a look here that I used the frames here as a way to set up appropriate height for each of these, so we have a nice sort of adjustment between the layers. And on the right side of it is going to be the media component, right? So that is the reason why we came here and we first set up the media component with all these variants. So we could then come here and easily change this if we have to. So let's say this would be, say we would have in real life, we would have this one here, but then below we would have a video. So I could just create here and then change this to video. And Because I set up the right sizing from the component itself, you don't have to worry about distancing between these since it is already part of the component itself. So you can just stack them. You can even auto layout them and just add as many results as you want, and you can see you have a nice feed of results, right? So we will look a bit more into that in the next video. And if you want to start here and you want to change this from left to right, then it's quite easy if all you do is select this layer and then you shift this layer, and you can see there's these sort of two dots, and this is helpful in order to readjust things easily on Figma. You can come here and just drag it to the left, and there you have it. Now you have the media on the left. You could come in here and change this to YouTube, and you essentially have the YouTube area for your search, right? So I could come in here, list things, and boom, now I have YouTube search results. The last component here is very simple, but it's got a nice touch to it, which is that we are actually using two components in one in this case. And this is called a Twitter result component. This is the piece here from our search result where the person may have a Twitter feed and it's showing some of the latest tweets. The awesome thing here is that we didn't have to create any single new component. All we had to do, well, we had to create the parent component for Twitter result, but this is actually a combination of search result and the tweet cards, right? So if I were to recreate this, all I have to do is copy paste one of these search result components. I can remove footer reference and description, and then I can essentially match the text information to give me a sort of Twitter feel. So just change that up. I don't want to add a link. I'm just going to remove it and do that, and then change the color to link. And I can remove the slug, right? So we don't need that part. And actually this is not a link. This is going to be a tertiary color. And now that we have this, I can come here to my TweetCard component. I can copy it and I can paste it right below the search component. And this is going to be a 12 pixel difference from the two components, and I can now copy paste it to the side, setting an 8 pixel difference. We can auto layout this, call it cards, and have 3 cards as shown in the Google example. And I can just go ahead and, let's say, change this text to make it a bit more realistic. So legalize comedy as it's shown on the top. And I can change the variant here to image, right? Now that we have that, we can group these two together. I'm going to hold Command-Alt-G to create a frame. I'm going to call it Twitter result. And I can do now Command-Alt-K to create a component. And there you go. We just created the very same component we had on top, and we had to create no inner components at all, just reuse the stuff we already had. And that's the amazing thing about design systems. So now if you zoom out from here, you can do Command period and then Shift 2 to have a look at your entire frame here for your Figma page. You can see that we actually created all of the components that we wanted in order to be able to do prototyping in the next video. So that is a wrap for components and variants and auto layout. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, make sure to hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for the upcoming video, which is also going to be the last of this Figma series on the Google search. We're going to be going into prototyping and animation, taking everything we've learned and everything we've built. I hope you stay safe, and I will catch you in the next one.